Everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. And now I'm going to step away from the microphone so you probably won't go. Yeah, just thank you for everyone for turning up. We're really glad, like, it's packed, and that's really important. And yeah, that's what our whole society is about. We're ASA for short. It's called the All African Student Link in Europe. And the most important thing for us is to get people talking about issues in Africa. We don't believe in charity or stuff like that. We just want to get people talking about issues, discussing them, and then we think productive answers can come out of that. Can everyone still hear me? Because I realised I've stepped away from the mic. A bit slower as well? Okay. Yeah, slow down. Yeah, we are a student organisation, but we do work off campus as well, so that's really important to us. We're involved in community things. So we helped out in Black History Month down in Brighton Centre, and we're looking to start a homework club, so twinning university students on Sussex campus and Brighton campus with Brighton students. Oh yeah, and also I'd like to stress, because in the run-up to this event we had things going on our website, and I'd like to stress that we are an independent organisation. We don't receive any funding apart from Sussex Uni. We don't receive any funding from US government or anything like that, because that issue was raised. And just thank you everyone for coming, and I'm going to pass you on now to Professor Kes van der Pijl.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. My dear friends here have asked me to open this conference, which is an honor that is quite undeserved, I can tell you, because there's nothing in my knowledge or activity that has entitled me to say anything very special here. But of course, on the way to this room, I had to think of something, and that is the following. I think the peculiarity of the African continent, apart from having produced the human species in the first place, is that for so long we have looked at this continent always in terms of what is below the soil or even on the soil, as I'll explain in a second. You know, there are places like Ghana, whose former name was the Gold Coast. There's of course the Ivory Coast. Cecil Rhodes hunted for diamonds and some other precious stuff in South Africa. Rhodesia was named after him, and so on and so forth. Most recently, of course, we have had important finds of oil in Africa, and what is pictured here is those countries which are currently in the market because of the extremely low land prices in Africa as replacement sources for food for other countries in the world. So Africa has recently been discovered as a sort of replacement agricultural area where food will be produced for people in Dubai and other Gulf states, for Asian states, and for a number of other locations. And then, of course, there's a famous statement by Larry Summers, who is again in the market as an advisor of President Obama, who made a name for himself in the 1980s by claiming that Africa was underpolluted. At the time he worked at the World Bank, and by his statement he meant that if you look at this continent, that there's a lot of garbage in the world which can still be dumped there. So if you think about these things, you know, ivory, gold, diamonds, oil, food, and in the end a garbage heap, you begin to wonder, where are the people who live there? You know, what will they eat when their land is being leased or sold to firms that will produce food for other continents? What will they get from the ivory, the gold, and all these other issues, and the oil, of course? And I think that is where the future of this continent is really very pertinent. Because we must realize that, and I guess everybody here knows that Africa as a continent of independent states began in roughly in the 1960s, with some latecomers in the 1970s, began as a continent of states, the boundaries of which had been drawn, of course, by the colonial powers. And one of the first and very wise decisions that were taken by the Organization of African Unity, today the African Union, was that the continent as such at no point would allow that these boundaries would be redrawn violently or otherwise because of the fact that every country, practically every country in Africa, is inhabited by many, many nationalities or ethnicities, or however you want to label them. And yet, we must expect that this negative decision, the decision not to allow redistribution of land and living areas, that this negative decision will not in the end be able to contain a continent that is full of people with their own aspirations and their own ambitions, who are at the same time looked on as being in the way, more or less, for the free access to all the riches that are below its soil, on its soil, and then the soil as a garbage heap. So we must expect that the near future will bring movement in Africa, that it was not just a one-off that people like Nkrumah or Lumumba made themselves the leaders of popular aspirations. That will come again. It's inevitable. It will take all kinds of forms, and it will put enormous pressure on the existing distribution of power, the existing distribution of wealth, and the existing distribution of land and territorial space in Africa. And I think it's in that light that we must think of the establishment of a US command for Africa, that we must think of the UN attempt to intervene and moderate the conflicts that are now going on. And I think if we have this conference, which is timely and important today, it must be with this in mind, that we cannot forget about the people who live there, their aspirations and their ambitions, and that these will not always take the form of merely constructive contribution to a peaceful debate, but they will express themselves in all kinds of forms, some of which we may like, some of which we may not like, but we must deal with them, and we must accept that that continent will make its own mark, just as other continents have done. That is what I wanted to say by way of an opening, and it's now my privilege to pass the baton to James Fairhead, who is a real connoisseur of the continent and a professor of anthropology at our university. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. I'm not going to speak. I'm going to chair this conference or session. And we have four real experts with us today who are going to share their views concerning the Africa Command and the issues that Africa Command raises for the broader engagements that we might have with the continent and for engagements that Africans have with their world. We have as first speaker Vincent Crawley, who's Deputy Director of Public Affairs at US Africa Command, who has come over from Stuttgart in Germany, where Africa Command is based. And he's going to speak first on what is Africom and its benefit to African people. Then we shall have three other speakers. Imara Woods has come over as co-director of Institute for Policy Studies from the USA, and she's going to speak as a critic of US foreign policy. Thirdly, Solon Kofi Dake has come as International Liaison Officer of the All Africa Student Headquarters in Ghana. He's actually just recently left that post and taken up as a graduate student at the University of Essex, and we wish him well there, but we're very pleased that he's managed to come here today to speak here on his topic, which is Africom Implications for Human Security and Development in Africa. Lastly though, but not least, Jeremy Keenan is here from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, author of Dark Sahara, and he's here going to speak on Africom and Al-Qaeda in Africa, creations of the West. Now these are enormously influential and important speakers, and I think it's wonderful that they've come, and I must thank them before they've spoken, simply for coming and agreeing to discuss this contentious issue with us. They're each going to speak for 15 minutes, one after another, and we're then going to have a question session, I shall be a fairly rigorous chair, keeping to time. I shall be a fairly rigorous chair in asking you all to come with questions, perhaps several questions from the floor, and then the panel will take those questions and then we'll go back to do that. The overall event, I must say, has been organised by a wonderful group, and I must thank above all the student organisation that has arranged this, and I think we'll have a chance to thank them at the end, but let's just thank them now. So, first of all, Vincent, would you like to take that?
I just want to thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak. I really like to explain what we do here with U.S. Africa Command. Just a background, so you know who you're talking to. I spent about 15 years as a news reporter before coming to work for the United States government. My experience in Africa is probably similar to most Americans, which is I was in Somalia during the famine, and then the follow-up when the U.S. intervened and militarily, perhaps under UN command, you ended up escalating the conflict. I was in Goma, in Rwanda in the mid-1990s, but just episodically, because that's where the hot story was. Did a lot of work. But I would just put this because I know what the U.S. military can and has done around the world, and I like to bring a little. I do this job. I do the job I'm doing now because I do believe strongly in the U.S. military's ability to help people. I will just ask who in the audience has seen pictures from the insides of one of their country's prisons. Who in the audience has seen pictures from the insides of a U.S.-run prison in Abu Ghraib, Iraq? I would just point out that we've all seen those photographs because a young American soldier saw what was happening, saw that there were photographs of it, didn't believe that that was the American way, and made sure that the world saw those photographs. So we have about 200,000 young people, American teenagers who join, young boys and girls who join our Army every year, and they have expectations for what the quality of their service will be. They're all volunteers, they all pass competitive entry exams, they have to continue education to be promoted. A lot of them are doing it to get college money in order to go to college. They all swear an oath to the U.S. Constitution, not to any individual or political party. This is just a very quick snapshot from last week's newspaper, just an example of what we do in Africa. A lot of people have a lot of things about what they think we do. What we work with is we have our young American military people working with their counterparts in Africa. This is an example from the new Liberian Army. The United States is working to help build a 2,200 person force from Liberia as a settlement to their 2003 settlement to their civil war. And we send about 2 or 3 dozen of our military people to work with their military people. Before Africa Command existed, this was all done by contractors under our State Department. Okay. This is the world as it existed for about 25 years as far as the United States Defense Department is concerned. The United States is a global power. And we can discuss that, well, it should be. But we have basically, from the early 1980s to 2008, Africa, 42 countries of Africa were administered, or military relations were administered by U.S. European Command. The Horn of Africa was administered by U.S. Central Command. The island nations were administered by the U.S. Pacific Command, which is headquartered here in Hawaii. European Command is headquartered here in Stuttgart, Germany. Central Command is actually headquartered in Florida. As Africa grew in importance, and as our people, our military people, were constantly traveling to Africa to do the kinds of programs that we continue to do, we're constantly being asked, why are you from European Command? What is so wrong with Africa that there is no Africa Command? That was asked and discussed at the government-to-government level quite frequently. It was never really discussed at the civic level, and as we learned when the announcement was made in February of 2007, there had been very little civic discussion of the role of the U.S. military in Africa, and so there was a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of confusion, and a lot of very harsh criticism about what we were doing. Fundamentally, Africa Command is a reorganization of the U.S. Department of Defense. We no longer have European Command, which is focused on NATO and the Europe relationship. We no longer have Central Command, which is focused on 2 wars in the Middle East and South Central Asia. We now have a U.S. Africa Command, which is focused on, we've got about 1,000 people who wake up every morning trying to think about providing the military support for U.S. foreign policy in Africa. This is a former Defense Department official used to call this the hidden agenda slide. These are the U.S. national interests in Africa. The U.S. is interested in fostering free and fair trade with competitive access to markets and resources. We are interested in fostering good governance. We are interested in countering illegal trafficking. We are addressing threats of violent extremism. In general, these interests overlap Africa and international interests. General Ward, my boss, likes to add that keep in mind that U.S. national interests lie in a stable continent of Africa. A lot of discussion on what's Africom really about. We can certainly get into that with the question and answer stage as well. U.S. foreign policy has what they call 3 pillars. I like to think of as 3 legs of a stool. Diplomacy, development, and defense. They call it the 3 Ds. Americans like to come up with buzzwords. A lot of the initial announcement of Africa Command was, a lot of people took it to be that the U.S. military, which was running things in Iraq, which was running things in Afghanistan, was suddenly going to be running things in Africa. The fact of the matter is that the Department of State's Africa Bureau was established in 1958, and the Defense Department came to the table about half a century later. We do have a large amount of funding compared to our Department of State colleagues. Our funding for Africa is about equal to our Department of State's funding for Africa, and the Department of Defense spends, you can count it different ways, it's upwards of $500 million on programs in Africa. Our Department of State, and working with USAID, administer about 10 times that amount of money in Africa. And Secretary of State Clinton very recently, a couple of weeks ago, basically reiterated the intent of the U.S. government to try to strengthen the development leg of that stool. And well, as our Defense Secretary, Secretary Robert Gates has been, he's been emphasizing for a couple of years now his concern that the military has been doing too much development work, and that he very much wants some of Defense Department funding to be more Defense Department funding to be going to our Department of State and Department of USAID. That's a work in progress, but certainly the Obama administration is moving along those lines. I would just add that Secretary of State Clinton is a pretty strong-willed person, and she's not about to cede any authority to the Defense Department that she doesn't think it should have. President Obama is the person who sets our agenda. And one of the things we like to underline is he began his speech, which basically is the authoritative U.S. policy guidance for Africa, his speech in Ghana in July. We must start from the simple premise that Africa's future is up to Africans. And that's where you will see what U.S. Africa Command does, is we are working to support, in the context of foreign policy, African solutions for African problems. The President's priorities for Africa: strong, sustainable democratic governments, strong public health programs. He made a point of peace and security are necessary. You can't have development, you can't have good governance if you don't also have stable militaries that are serving the good of all of their people. I'm not going to dwell on this one too long. This is kind of based on a briefing that our General Ward and folks on down give to all of our visitors. I don't like to alter briefings too much. We are well aware of the problems in Africa: piracy, trafficking, irregular militaries. But one thing that really, if you fundamentally want to know why is there an Africa Command now, it has to do with the incredible opportunities, the incredible political growth and maturation of Africa. The African Union's Peace and Security Council is well on the way to establishing 5 regional peacekeeping brigades, and the United States is in direct support of 3 of those peacekeeping brigades. We've been training peacekeepers in Africa since 1997. We've trained about 180,000 African peacekeepers to date. About 42% of all UN and African Union peacekeepers working in Africa are from African nations. The African goal is for 100% of their peacekeepers to come from within Africa itself. They want to stop being net importers of security. Our folks have been traveling for the last 2.5 years, talking with African leadership in nearly every country in Africa with a recognized government. If you distill what the Africans are telling us they want for their military forces, it is they want capable and accountable, very important, accountable military forces there to protect all the people of their countries. They want strengthened security institutions like the African Union Peace Security Council. They want to be able to support the international peace efforts, and they very much want the ability to dissuade and deter and defeat threats, which is very much a classic military goal. And I would just add, General Ward just put out some his latest guidance, which is to as we support the President's priorities, he wants us to be building partner security capacity in areas such as support and special staff capabilities, building NCO Corps for Africa. We're going to work in concert with the partners, with other people who are working in Africa. We want to reinforce success, work with the countries which are the regional leaders in Africa. We want to address the transnational challenges such as terrorism, drug trafficking. Help to work that we do should be aimed in such a way that it is not, we need to build an understanding of what others are doing in the international community and the foreign policy community so that we don't intrude on it or do work that's not appropriate for us to be doing. And we are a military headquarters. We will respond to crisis as directed by our President. I'm just going to give you a few examples of some of the work that we do in Africa. The natural fire involved about 500-600 U.S. troops in northern Uganda with another 600 troops from, I think, 4 to 5 other regional countries. They were kind of doing this took place in, I'm going to say it was October, and it was basically a crisis response humanitarian exercise. I've seen some press reports. Yes, they were armed. Our troops travel armed for self-defense reasons. That includes doing qualifications with weapons and things. That region is very important to think about because that's in northern Uganda is where the Lord's Resistance Army and other regional conflicts have been taking place for many years. The government of Uganda was interested in being able to reach out and start rebuilding some of the institutional infrastructure in that part of the world. And so that's one of the reasons why they asked us to conduct that exercise in that specific location. We have a counterterrorism partnership, and I'm sure that one of my colleagues is going to talk about this in greater detail. I will just emphasize we're not doing combat patrols anywhere in Africa, and certainly not in the Sahara. There have been times in the past when the United States has done that, under Africa Command, which really has had responsibility for this for the last year and a half. We are working, our special operations forces are working in a partnership capacity with the countries of the region, most of whom are quite capable, some of whom are less capable. One of the biggest issues they have is if Algeria chases a extremist group across its border into northern Mali, they've solved something for Nigeria but haven't solved anything for northern Mali. So working on cross-border information sharing, things like that. I mentioned briefly our peacekeeper training. This is in partnership with the Department of State. It began as a U.S. military program. State Department took it over when we began fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan because we didn't have the United States didn't have the troops to accomplish that kind of training. It's been largely done by military contractors who tend to be retired former military people. Since Africa Command has been created, General Ward has testified a couple times before Congress. His goal is to get American troops back into the peacekeeper training. We've dramatically increased the number of active duty uniformed personnel taking part in that peacekeeper training. When folks want to have we train about 20 battalions, several tens of thousands of troops each year, largely largely immediately as a precursor for them to deploy to a peacekeeping exercise.
Just a couple minutes.
That's okay, very good. I'm almost done anyway. I'll just go quickly. We do a lot of, you guys are involved in education, a lot of military education for militaries are also very important. Our International Military Education Training Program basically brings international exchange students to the United States to train alongside American military people. They sit in the same classroom, they listen to the same discussions, they meet after work, and very much a good exposure to the American ethics of you may not have voted for your commander-in-chief currently, but that doesn't mean that you're going to actually actively undermine him. Very quickly, HIV/AIDS is a major problem among some African militaries. So we provide counseling and testing for about 220,000 military people and their families. Military people are young, they are paid, they travel, they do all the things that young people do. If you have a infected HIV population, 5% of the people are HIV positive. Without intervention, your military will statistically be 10% of the population, double the local population. And I'll say my truth and advertising slide for last. This is our people. This is what we're doing in Africa today. We have at any given time 130 to 175 special operations people, usually in teams of 8 to 12, working with the militaries of the Trans-Sahara. We've got about, numbers vary, we are just taking over from Department of State the defense sector reform mission in Liberia as part of currently the Armed Forces of Liberia are under United Nations and Nigerian administration because they completely did away with the previous military to train 2,200 Liberian soldiers. They had to vet 17,000 people to come up with 2,000 people who did not have prior human rights abuse records. We have a single base in Africa, Combined Joint Task Force, Horn of Africa, and Camp Lemonnier, doing a lot of these programs I've been talking about 1,900 people. We inherited that from Central Command. All the basing rights issues have been taken care of. We're not going to remove them. We have at any given time, all around the coast of Africa, several Africa Partnership Station vessels, which are basically doing training alongside the African navies and coast guards. We currently have, although it's temporary, unmanned aerial vehicles flying out of the Seychelles across this region here, kind of a test program to check the feasibility of tracking that over large distances of water. And I'll just say, we pride ourselves on the quality and transparency of our website. We have a lot of unfiltered transcripts. probably have a transcript of this presentation in its entirety up on the website, unless it gets too exciting. And then we will, and we news clips. We have French. We invite public feedback. We're certainly, very much willing to answer your questions about what the U.S. military is doing in Africa. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleague.
Well, thank you very much.
Please go ahead and pull that down.
Without more ado, let me introduce Hear Alkebu-lan. Thank you very much for coming.
Wonderful. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Wonderful. I am so honored to be here, and I really want to thank all the organizers. I feel like I've gotten to know them over the last few days, and I am so awed by you all for your dedication to creating a space for debate, for understanding, for raising the profile of Africa, for all that you do. I just want to kind of say hear, hear, and thank the organizers for this. Incredible. I've also really had the honor to just walk around your campus over the last few days, since yesterday, and I was amazed at the level of activism, level of just incredible intelligence, and dedication to a better world that I saw exhibited on your campus. And I'm really, really, really proud of all of you and this future generation, because I believe that you are all visionaries, and I thank you for carving out time to be here tonight. Thank you so much. I was especially struck by those handing out, and I saw you come in the room, I was so excited, handing out information on the cuts to the education system that could impact your campus here at Sussex. Cuts to education, right? Core building blocks of healthy societies that will affect all of you, potentially, in this room. We have seen those same cuts happening in the United States. The University of California, I hope you all have seen all that the students there have been doing to stand up, to say no to cuts in education, right? To stand up to demand a right to education. Ultimately, what we're here about tonight, we're talking about Africa, we're talking about Africom, but what we're here for is to say that there is a vision of the world moving forward, a vision of the world that says that people have a right to education, to healthcare, to housing, to decent jobs with decent wages. People have a right to these things. But for far too long, the choices being made by those in power are choices that have brought death and destruction. It's as simple as that. The PowerPoint, I have to say, was really nice. I was taking notes and all, and I'm sure many of you were, right? But at its core, what is happening is a decision to emphasize building up, strengthening, they say professionalizing, armies, right? Machineries to kill, right? And it comes at a cost. And the cost is most directly in human lives, but it is also costs of lost funds for education, for healthcare, for housing, right? So time is short. Hopefully we'll have time in a dialogue to talk about all these things in the broader context. Huh? But I have to say, I'm from Liberia, and I'm now working in Washington. Somebody's two thumbs. You Liberian too? Hey, hey! 2 thumbs up. I love it. You know, I'm in Washington at a think tank called the Institute for Policy Studies. It's a progressive think tank. We have a vision of a better world that I believe that many of you in this room share. I am what we call a public scholar. So I came to the Institute really coming from the development side, having worked at Oxfam America and wanting to really be a part of helping to shape U.S. foreign policy, which impacts so much of the world. And that's pretty much what I've been doing, U.S. foreign policy for the last few years. So maybe we can talk about that, and I can invite any of you who want to intern with us or write for us to do so in the question and answer period. Coming to Africom. I really applaud the opening remarks. You said you had nothing to say, but you actually hit the nail on the head. Do people say that here in the UK?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm realizing all these differences in sayings. Huh? So it hit the nail on the head, yeah? Because it is all about the resources. It has been, really since 1884, all about the resources. So the scramble of Africa then was to control the resources on the ground and to fuel a global economy that was really underpinned by human exploitation in the form of slavery. We've got to just cut it at its core. That's what it was about then, and I hate to break it to you all, that's what it's about now, right? What happened, a dramatic thing, so you know, the Pentagon will have you think, all they're doing is reorganizing. What's the problem? You have 5 commands controlling Africa. Controlling is actually their word, right? So why shouldn't they create a command for Africa? Sounds reasonable. Europe has one, why shouldn't Africa? Well, what is unclear in their presentation is that it started to happen around the time that one critical change happened in terms of the US relationship with Africa. One critical change, and it is one little word that when you think often about Iraq and the war in Iraq, you realize was really at the source of that conflict as well. Anybody know what that word is? Oil. I've heard many things, but I hope it's all about oil, because often that's at the core. So Africa, as of 2008, outstripped the Middle East as a supplier of oil to the United States. Did you all know that? How many people in the room knew that? Outstripped. More oil coming from Africa than from the Middle East as of 2008, according to the US Department of Energy statistics, right? We have to understand that back under the Bush administration, Dick Cheney held this, well, they did a national intelligence estimate. He had a task force that helped to prepare this. And they said that by the end of that decade, which is actually this year, 2010, 15% of the oil that comes to the United States will come from Africa. Well, as of last year, it was 23%, right? That was before, are you all listening? Before oil was found in Sierra Leone, which just happened a few months ago, before oil was found in Ghana, right? And we know there are likely to be even more discoveries throughout the continent. We have to talk about issues of climate justice and of moving from a global addiction to oil, because at the root of that addiction to oil is the building up of militaries and military architectures to control it. But it isn't just oil, right? It isn't just oil, and you all in this room probably know this already. Without the coltan that comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I'm so honored to know that you all at this university have twinned with the University of Goma, right? Without the coltan that comes from the Congo, you all know this already? You can't have cell phones or computers or any kind of electronic devices. Without the cobalt that comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you cannot make lithium batteries for hybrid cars. So oil is big, but it's not just oil. It's other vital resources without which the global economy cannot function, that are sourced, and increasingly over this coming decade will be sourced in Africa. So what we stand up for, really, 15 minutes goes quickly, so you all have to engage us in real space at the question and answer period. What we're standing up for when it comes to resisting Africom is really creating a space to say there is a different way, right? Because the two changes, aside from the organizational scrambling that you saw on the map presented earlier, there are two real fundamental changes that happened because of the Bush administration doctrine, right? Of expanding unilaterally engagement with militaries, expanding the power of the defense arm of foreign policy. Right? It is that Bush-era doctrine that says, let the military take the lead. They have the money. In the U.S., there's another saying, follow the purse strings. You follow the purse strings in the U.S., it leads you back to the Department of Defense. They have tremendous power because they have a ton of money. The U.S. military spends over $1 trillion, right, to kill, essentially. Right? $1 trillion, more than all the other governments on this planet combined. And when you think about the power of the U.S. military in U.S. foreign policy, it's ironic because even if they stood within their area of defense, it would be appalling. But what is new with the Bush administration, and they sort of cooked this up in Iraq, is that the Defense Department can also do disasters response, and hopefully we'll talk about Haiti during the question and answer period because it's a critical example of it, right? Can also do development. They can build schools. They can run and build health clinics, right? What many of us say is as if you're putting this sort of velvet glove over the fist of the military. Because if they're building schools, it will be to pursue military interests, and often it is because of economic interests in that particular region. It's critical to connect the dots. The other piece that's new with the Africa Command is the use of private military contractors. It's so funny because with the slides, you think, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with that. Uniform or non-uniform, they're former soldiers. What's wrong with that? What it doesn't say in that slide is that these are the same folks. Blackwater. How many people in this room have heard of Blackwater? They've changed their name. Do you know their new name? How many people know their new name? Z is their new name. Even under the new name, they're doing the same thing, right? What we have seen in Iraq is happening in Africa and in other parts of this world. The increased use of unaccountable private military contractors has led to disastrous issues of human rights violations, and in particular, violation of women, particularly sexual violence towards young women throughout the African continent. I hope we'll have a chance. I was listing all the countries that he referenced so that we could talk about each of them. I don't know that we'll be able to do that in this period of time, but I do want to talk a bit about Uganda, because Uganda was really the first example of the Africa Command in action. About a year ago, in between, it was ironic, huh? In between the election of Barack Obama and the inauguration of Barack Obama was the first official excursion of the Africa Command, and it was Uganda. The Ugandan army. Anybody from Uganda in the room? Oh, so hopefully you'll have a chance to share, and you probably know it best. The Ugandan army has been really, for years, criticized for human rights violations. But the U.S., in its first excursion of the Africa Command, decided that they would twin. They'll do their own twinning with the Ugandan military. And this twinning would be to apprehend or kill Joseph Kony. For whatever reason, there was a decision that years of diplomacy, of trying to bring peace, those days were over. That the only reaction, the only response to Uganda now was to launch a military attack. So the U.S. Africa Command, together with the Ugandan Army, did launch this Operation Lightning Thunder, as they called it in Uganda. And in fact, what happened, and it was ironic, because for the first time, the New York Times, almost as it happened, was covering this issue. Very rare occurrence when we see things like the war in Iraq and how slow papers were to really state the truth. But the New York Times covered the atrocities. It was civilians, innocent civilians, often women and children, caught in the mix. And the objective of apprehending Kony didn't happen. Decisions were made, though, that peacemaking and peace building could not bring a resolution to the problem, that the only answer was the military answer. And it failed, and civilians paid the price. We see in example after example of all those that were listed in the PowerPoint presentation, instances in which decisions are being made to put the military and a military response first, to build, to train militaries. We have also seen what has happened with those trainings. Probably one of the most dramatic and most recent, well, there are two that come to mind. Mauritania, where US training actually strengthened the power of the military, and the military decided they wanted to take over. They launched a coup and have held a grip on power since. Guinea, another example, where trained again by the US military, the Guinean army took over about a year ago. They threatened, even though they said they wouldn't run for office, right? They threatened to hold on to power. And it's only negotiations really over the last week that have pushed Guinea back from an abyss where the military was determined to hold on at all costs. There are repercussions to the decisions being made to militarize foreign policy, to militarize and prioritize relationships with militaries. It is most often civilians that pay the price. I guess I want to also just spend a moment and talk about Somalia. And I hope we'll have time to address it further in the question and answer. Because Somalia was probably, again, the most blatant example of Africom in its full effect. You often hear about the drone attacks in Pakistan. How many people have heard about the drone attacks in Somalia? Yeah. The US Army, leading US foreign policy, has caused devastation in Somalia. Essentially, Somalia is a sad case of, because of its strategic location, especially during the Cold War, the US and the USSR took turns funneling weapons into Somalia, creating a government that was really ungovernable. And since the ouster of Siad Barre back in 1992, really there was no government in Somalia until an interesting thing happened in June of 2006. Somalis themselves were able to pull together and create a government that held. It held for 6 months, from June to December 2006. By December 2006, the US decided, oh, they have Islamic in their name, they must be extremists. They must be linked with Al-Qaeda. Even though Somalis tell you it was a modern